It probably seemed like a big purchase back in 1950, a major league expenditure, if you'll pardon the pun, because that's exactly what it was when Mr. Walter O'Malley bought from the famous Branch Rickey a franchise then known as the Brooklyn Dodgers. It cost him $15 million to pay for them bums, as the lovable but ball-dropping team was called there in New York City. Now, well over a half a century later, as everyone in the sports world knows, Peter O'Malley turned around and sold the same team, now the Los Angeles Dodgers, to Rupert Murdoch's Fox Group for a cool $311 million. By far and away the highest price ever paid for a team in any sport, anywhere, anytime. And yes, that's a 21,000% profit for the original investment. Not bad for 48 years of what most of us would consider a dream job, owning a baseball team. And then we move into the question under discussion here. What is appropriate to do with that kind of nest egg? That's a whole Dodger stadium full of cash. $311 million is a lot of Dodger dogs and many, many nights sitting in a luxury box right over home plate. Is it wrong to hoard that money? Is it wrong to stash it away so that the O'Malley name will always be a dynasty in sports, wielding power and clout right into the 21st and 22nd centuries? Here in Luke chapter 12, as we study the parable that we're calling the senseless software king, it doesn't appear that the rich man in question did anything wrong except for one mistake. He got rich on a lucky break, which is certainly all right to do. He upgraded his operation. That's acceptable too, tearing down some small barns and building bigger ones. He planned for himself a life of ease, not much different from what every retiree in the world dreams about. But God said to the rich farmer with the bulging barns, "You fool, you're going to die tonight." And then what? You stored up things for yourself, but were not rich toward God. Again, it's quite helpful to read the entire chapter where a particular story is told. Luke chapter 12 actually has about 6 sections to it, at least as divided in some Bibles. And it says right in verse 1, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples." Here's a little hidden point. Jesus was a very popular speaker and teacher. Thousands were hanging on to his every word. He had followers and devotees and people of means who wanted to subscribe to his monthly newsletter, so to speak. We could easily assume that if Christ had wanted to pursue worldly wealth and amass a temporal fortune, he could have done that. He could have taken up big offerings and lived in comfort, just working his miracles, appearing as a guest on the Trinity Cable Network, and publishing a Zondervan bestseller every year or two. And so, when he talks about the dangers of wealth and the perspectives that a person blessed by God should hold to, we can take those words seriously. And then as we study through this chapter, looking at these several subsections, we find some interesting clues. We're especially interested, of course, in what Christ might mean by that phrase, being rich toward God. Again, Jesus doesn't teach that it's wrong to prosper. It's not wrong to invest for tomorrow. And it's not a sin to enjoy some years of comfort and leisure after decades of hard work. It's not even wrong to luck into a big fortune. Christ told other parables where people did exactly that. But this is a vital warning to remain in an attitude of being rich toward God. In the first 12 verses, Christ talks about not being afraid of a person's enemies. If my Father doesn't even forget the little sparrow, he says, he for sure won't forget to protect you. But then notice this in verse 8. I tell you, whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge him before the angels of heaven. So, whether you and I are poor or fabulously wealthy, Here's a necessary ingredient in a person's life: a willingness to acknowledge Jesus Christ, to say publicly before others, I'm committed to Christ. I belong to Him. In fact, you might safely become a millionaire, even a multimillionaire, but only as long as you're willing to say on CBS 60 Minutes or a late night talk show or interview, if you're being interviewed for Money Magazine, Jesus Christ is my Lord. I owe my first allegiance to Him. Now, apparently in this story, there was no such acknowledging. Very clearly, this man, as he tore down barns and built bigger ones, was saying to himself, I will trust in this. This fortune right here is my security and my future. In this haughty little diatribe of boasting, we noticed one word 4 times. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he declares, I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. A very wealthy man was also a dedicated born-again believer. And he had a house that was filled with nice things, expensive furnishings. How did he keep from worshiping those things, from trusting in his money? A fellow Christian once asked, how do you do that? The man replied, I mentally have put a little sticker on every single thing I own. And the man said, well, what does the sticker say? And he replied, soon to be burned. In other words, this man was acknowledging Jesus as his sustainer and heaven as his future home. In the next section of Luke 12, Jesus talks about not worrying. Look at the birds of the field, he says. Look at the lilies. They don't worry about tomorrow, and my Father cares for them. And again, here is this theme, trusting in God for our security, acknowledging Him. In fact, it's right here in this section, part of Luke 12, where we find the very famous bit of biblical advice. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This passage is referring to the Bible teaching that we should care for the poor among us, which of course we can't do if we're worried and insecure and fixated on our own needs. But these verses are telling us the same consistent truth. Our security, our identity, our first passion is Jesus Christ. This attitude is one of being rich toward God. The next section of this wonderful Bible passage has this title in my Bible, Watchfulness. And Jesus advises his listeners, be watching for the Master's coming. Be waiting for my return. Is it harder for a wealthy, successful person to be watching for Jesus to return? Harder? Yes. Impossible? No. But it's a challenge to keep the second coming of Christ foremost in our thinking, especially if we're distracted by our goals and our possessions, and particularly if we're so satisfied with this life that we're not really that passionate about the next one. Jesus also says in Luke verse 15, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So we need to watch for the coming of the Master. And we need to also watch for the coming of another master named greed as he rears his ugly head in our life. You look into your heart, and I look into mine. Is greed growing? Is a love for things and wealth and power and influence slowly but steadily asserting itself as a dominant force? In his book, Living by Faith, President Jimmy Carter tells the story of Millard and Linda Fuller. Millard was a clever, inventive entrepreneur type who just had everything he touched turn to gold. even as a student at the University of Alabama. He was a moneymaker. He'd get bootleg copies of the student roster, figure out who had a birthday on what date, and then offer his services to parents back home as the go-between to get a cake and flowers delivered. I mean, this guy knew how to make money. And as a young married lawyer, he began to do even better. Except in one area, in his marriage. Finally, Linda told him that she was leaving him and returning home back to New York. Well, he came to his senses and begged her and the family to stay with him. And he actually made this promise: honey, I'll give away all of our money if you want me to, and put away all of these projects of mine, and instead I'll join you in any kind of work that we can do together. And that's exactly what they did. They joined a kind of Christian biracial commune there near Plains, Georgia, known as Koinonia Farm. Koinonia being a Greek Bible word meaning brotherhood. He spent 5 years there helping poor families build houses for themselves. From there, Millard and Linda Fuller began their own dream, which they called Habitat for Humanity, an organization that helps underprivileged people all around the world get into affordable houses which they build themselves. Maybe you've heard of it. Former President Jimmy Carter serves on the board and actually puts on his blue jeans and travels all around the globe, perspiring and nailing and drywalling right next to the excited people who are soon going to be moving into these brand new, very modest, but serviceable homes. Habitat for Humanity. Get this. As of the year 2020, if you Google it on your computer, Habitat for Humanity has now helped more than 30 million people. Hundreds of thousands of needy families who inhabit new homes in thousands of communities all over the United States and Canada, and also over 100 countries around the world. Millard and Linda say that Habitat uses the theology of the hammer. And I like their second description even better because it gives such affirmation to this parable of being rich toward God as told by Christ. This, they say, is the economics of Jesus.